Hello there! It's time for Spirits
and Cousins.
I'm Tish.
And I'm Courtney.
And today we're going to talk about the tools of the trade. But first, we need to talk about what we're drinking. And tonight, Courtney's going to talk about what we're drinking. So Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you.
In my delicious glass, we have a single barrel Jack Daniels. It has some really nice subtle notes of caramel with some spices, a little bit of fruity notes too. It's pretty good.
Have you had that before, or is this a first?
I have not. This is my first time drinking the single barrel. I do have to say I prefer Gentleman Jack to this, but it's another good option.
Well, I have to admit, you got me to try Gentleman Jack. I thought that I was too snobby to try it, and it actually is really good.
It is good.
So
next time we'll have to do a taste test, one versus the other.
Yes. That sounds like a plan. I like it. I like Gentleman Jack. There's a lot of new ones you turned me on to that I wouldn't have drank in the past, but I have enjoyed. More to come on that one. Okay. So what shows have we watched lately or listened to? I will be honest that I haven't had time to watch. I've been very busy over the last few weeks, but I know that I did the first one with Kindred Spirits, and I think you actually watched a new season, new episode of which show?
Ghost Hunters. They're back as of 4/7. And I'm about halfway through the episode. I tend to like them. I like how they look into the history, but they also, they definitely look to see what might be real or what might be, could be creating some things that look like paranormal, but actually aren't. Like, for instance, they took a picture of outside of a window and they're thinking it's a face. Well, it was the chandelier. So I really like that they take those pieces and decide, is this actually a spirit in the window or is it something different?
That's kind of like what you do. I mean, I've noticed with the way you think about these investigations and how you just overall think about spirits and paranormal is you make sure by trying to debunk whatever it is you're hearing or seeing first to make sure it's real and that it's not, for lack of a better way of saying it, your imagination that's pointing you in a direction. I've noticed that with you.
Thanks. I try and do that. It's important to me to have some skepticism, and it can be difficult at times because I am a medium. And so some of the knowledge that I gain is just through being a channel for those spirits. So those are things that I can't explain. And right. I also can't, when the knowledge just comes through like that, there is no evidence for it. And so that can be the hard part of medium work. It's like, how do you find that evidence to show that it's happening? And that's where I also appreciate being able to debunk these other things. It's important to this
Got
field.
it. Okay. Let's see. Any burning questions or thoughts on this episode? I know I have one. When are you going to officially be a docent at the Big Sur Lighthouse? That's my burning question.
Isn't that so exciting?
Yes.
Oh, I'm hoping by June or July.
Gosh, I mean, I'm surprised they don't make you do and learn sea rescues for as long as they make you go through the program out there.
It'll be about 4 months by the time I'm an official docent.
Well, that'll be exciting.
Very exciting.
I know, because then you will be able to go there anytime you'd like, it sounds like, and investigate.
Yes and no. What the other person who enjoys paranormal and I are doing is we're going to see what we can come up with for the summer to do paranormal things. I'm not sure how much I can speak on that right now because it's not for certain yet.
Okay. Well, more to come on that. I know that it's only, about 40 minutes from where we are here on the Central Coast of California.
It is.
Great. So today's episode, The Tools of the Trade, in part 1, we're going to talk about the actual fancy tech, as Courtney puts it, the fancy tech. And in part 2, we're going to talk about the old school tools. So again, today in part 1, we're going to talk about the fancy tech. What tech do we use? What do we prefer? What's worked for us, and any experiences as we go along. And we'll go from there. So, Courtney, what tech or high tech tools, devices do you prefer to use?
Well, we have a good amount of devices. I tend to prefer the Ghost Stop Spirit Box is one of my favorites. And that is just a nice standby. It's not fancy, but it's really well done. That's one of my favorites. We've been playing with the Robo Box from Supernatural Inc. And have had some interesting things come through with that one. I would say that the more I use it, the more I do like it. I like being able to play with the frequency tones, especially because those high pitched tones aren't driving batty.
And
so it's nice to be able to do that.
And also when we think of like kind of fancy tech or high tech, it's things like the Spirit Box, which is kind of an EVP sort of tool, which is what you were just talking about. The Ovilus Envoy, which is, another type of device, at EMF meters, laser grids, infrared cameras. So we're going to go through some of those today. And a question that I have is, you mentioned 2 different ones. Are they expensive?
The Spirit Box from Ghost Stop, I don't remember what it's technically called. It is not. It is under $100. And that was the first Spirit Box I ever purchased. And I do like it. It's pretty simple. It has an antenna on it. You can change AM to FM frequencies. There's also a spot for an SD card, so you can record. And that's been really, really great.
And then what about the fancy Spirit Box?
The fancy one is the Robo Box by Supernatural Inc. And I like it. We've had some pretty good EVPs from it and some talking. I think the hard part is it's bigger, and so it's not always easy to carry around with you. It's not very big, but it's not small enough to easily go into a bag.
Yeah, it's kind of like a box the size of a square or rectangular shaped Bluetooth speaker. It seems like it's maybe 12 inches by 8 inches high, something like that. I noticed that they all kind of look a little old school. We'll get into why they look the way they look when we get into how they work and what it is.
It's a really neat looking box. I like it. It is definitely making its way up there in terms of use for me.
And you also use a lot of just voice recorders, which capture EVPs as well, right?
I do. I don't use that as frequently. For whatever reason, I don't get a lot of EVPs that way. And so I do have one. It's just not a tool that I personally use a lot. One of my friends who I used to do ghost hunting with frequently, that's her thing. She loved doing EVPs, and she would get a lot.
One of the things I notice on some of these programs, and I notice that I watched you do it as well, is a lot of times you'll come to an investigation with everything in the bag. And is it pretty common to kind of first turn everything on and then through a process of elimination start pulling stuff out that doesn't seem to be effective at that investigation or during that time? What's your approach? Do you typically, like I've seen you do, you turn several on kind of at once to see what's going to pick up and then turn off the ones that don't seem to be catching any type of energy or EVPs or anything? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I usually start with the spirit boxes because we can get the most information possibly from them because ghosts can speak through it infinitely. So that's typically one of the first ones that I set up is the Spirit Box by Ghost Stop or the Robo Box or both.
And how many do you use at once? I mean, what's common? How many would you actually be using during an investigation, all going kind of at once?
Well, I'll turn on a spirit box and I'll take out an EMF meter. Those are typically the first two
Mm-hmm.
things that I do. And then I see which one might be working better or it's picking up more of the energy. When I first started out in this, I used the EMF a lot. And that was one of my sole means of communication other than using my camera. So that's one that I like using. However, I found in these past couple of years, it hasn't been working as well as it used to. So I don't tend to use the EMF meter as frequently as I used to. And that's what I find. It's things ebb and flow. And you and I have talked a lot about this. Do they know how to use the new fancier ones? And does old school work better than the new technology? And that's something you and I have just continue to talk about and are curious about it. And oftentimes we tend to go back to the old school methods.
You're absolutely right. It's really strange. I was listening to another investigator that was on a podcast a while back, and she was saying that the reason that some of the old school stuff works better is it really has a lot to do with how long that spirit has been away from the earth or away from, being alive. And it makes sense because some of this new tech, they'd have to know how to use a computer, for God's sakes. I mean, the thing like cycles through words and, they have to know how to push buttons. Whereas, some of the old school stuff is a little bit easier for them, I think, to use their energy towards, or at least that's what you've shared with me.
What equipment have you found helpful?
I haven't been doing this long, and I've kind of been doing these investigations with you. But I would tell you that the spirit box and the flashlight really stand out for me. If you're just going to ask very basic questions, then I see the pendulum and the dowsing rods work really well. But I would have to say that I'm most convinced by the results we get from the flashlight lately.
Yeah, the flashlight lately has been doing a fantastic job for us.
So I'm going to call.
I'll have to put up some videos on our Instagram on that.
So I'm going to call that more old school because it's just a flashlight. We'll cover that in the second part of this, but I'm going to hop into several different tools that are used or that we use. And those include Spirit Box, EVPs, the Envoy Ovilus, the EMF meters, the laser grids, the infrared cameras, temperature gauges, voice recorders. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain briefly what each one is, and then Courtney is going to be able to talk about it and give some of her insights around it. And then hopefully that'll give all of you a better sense for how these work when Courtney typically wants to use that type of equipment and what to expect. So with that, let's start with a spirit box. That is a form of an EVP, right, Courtney? Yeah. So simply put, it's a radio at the end of the day, but it's a rather unique one. What makes it unique is its tools and features look like and leverage, how radio signals work. While it is a radio, it has a slight modification to it that enables it to rapidly scan multiple stations at once. So it's like nonstop scanning as opposed to standard radios that play a single station at once. The spirits are able to speak through this static, through this energy. So with radio stations, you can hear them, in the background. But what you want to listen for is not the stations themselves, but what comes through in the white noise. That's when you get responses. Yeah. And the one thing you'll notice is that spirit boxes always look a little bit retro. And I've come to learn in my research on this that it is on purpose. because many spirits have not necessarily been here in the more modern world, but are typically, they've been away from us for decades. It can be for centuries, I guess, and there is an idea that the spirit boxes have sort of a retro look, so it looks a little more appealing to them. I have no idea whether that's the case or not. Mm-hmm. That's just in my research what I read. And while the main distinguishing feature with the spirit box over a standard radio is that it can rapidly scan, I like to think it has other adjustments on it too, depending on, how high pitched you want the scanned noises to come in, versus not. And there's a lot of little adjustments that get it right, so it's easier on your ears. But some additional features is some spirit boxes, like one of the ones that Courtney talked about, has the ability to record the phenomena and save the recordings. It also, another feature is it does speed up the scanning process. It has some noise canceling circuits in it and some sound filtration. And sometimes it can show rises or falls in the temperature of the location you're at, temperate meters. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to have Courtney tell us about experiences with spirit boxes, what she really thinks of them, and when and what circumstance she'll use them for.
Well, like I said, it's typically the first piece of equipment I pull out because we can get the most details if the spirit knows how to and understands how to work it. That's the first thing I bring out. What's nice about the spirit box, the ghost stop one, is that, again, you can change it between AM, FM. You can choose how fast it scans. And then it also has that recording piece in it. And what you and I have experienced together is we had a really lovely conversation with the lighthouse keeper, Emily Fish, at Point Pinos with this spirit box. And she was responding to us really well, very easily. And that was probably the longest conversation I've ever had using the spirit box. And that was super cool. With the RoboBox, what I like about the RoboBox is you can't adjust the AM, FM. It's not at all like that, but you can adjust some of those tone levels. And you and I have found that we have a comfortability level and prefer the lower tones versus the higher ones. Right. But I also think we get more from the lower tones. And I don't know how that works or why. But I do really like the RoboBox. I think that that old school look to it, I think it's pretty simple, but it has it can be used pretty easily. And I like that Great. Too. There's not a lot to have to figure out with it.
So let's move on to the next piece of equipment. It's called an obelisk. And we happen to have the Envoy obelisk. And an obelisk is basically a speak and spell for ghosts and spirits. The device contains a database of words and syllables. And after a question is asked, changes in temperature or magnetic fields caused by spirits can draw a response from the device. When the obelisk first turns on, users are supposed to kind of let it warm up because it can give false responses. We've got one of these, but we rarely use it, huh?
We don't. And I think it's more about you and I having to play around with it to see how we can get it to work better for us. We probably don't give it enough time to warm up is a piece of it. And that reminds me that that'll be something when we first start, that would be really good to start doing, is letting it warm up. But I think it's a really neat device. And I love the different options of it.
Yeah, no, you can choose whether it answers yes or no. You can choose whether it has words that come through. You can choose whether it goes through a cycle of letters and the spirit can choose the letters and spell their own words. One of the things, you can do happy faces. You remember it had emojis.
It has emotion reactions.
Yep. The other thing that is interesting when I hear other investigators talk about an obelisk is when there's words that come through that are outside of the database. And I've heard them talk about actually going back to whoever built it and checking on words that were coming through that they questioned, that they were part of the database of words and syllables that come stock on it. And that's when, in my opinion, it gets a little spooky, is when words come through that really the device isn't set up to be able to interpret. So there's a lot going on with Anomalous. I think that it is still sort of new for us, and we're learning what and how to get it going and set it up. But what are your final thoughts on this as a tool?
I think we need to play around more with it because I think it could be a fantastic tool. My big concern about it is the level of sensitivity, because what I've played around with it is if I tap on the floor, it'll make the device go off like something happened. And so the sensitivity we need to play around more with.
Makes sense.
So we'll see.
Okay.
It definitely deserves some more playing around with.
Yeah, I feel like when I get to go with you on anything that you're investigating, the amount of equipment is growing. Well, let's try this. Well, let's try that. And you've got everything. I feel like we're amassing a lot of different tools, and I guess it just depends on how the spirit feels like talking to us and what channel they want to use. Okay, so on to EMF meters. This is quite simple. Probably anyone listening to this podcast knows that you see and hear about EMF meters on all the shows, including Ghost Adventures and other paranormal TV shows. Professional ghost hunters frequently use EMF meters in their toolkits. EMF meters detect fields emitted by moving electrically charged objects. So EMF is electromagnetic field. That's what it stands for. It is an EMF meter. And the theory lies at a combination of an electric field produced by a charged object and the field created when the object moves. Ghost hunters turn to EMF meters as the instruments yield very tangible, measurable data, and the data collection lends credibility to an activity, because when you have activity going on in a room, especially if it's right around you, that EMF meter, you can see the hand flipping back and forth, and it measures. You can see the measurements on the screen, and it really does lend credibility to the activity and lends itself to a whole different interpretation of what you're actually seeing, because it basically says something different has just came right in front of you and registering on the device. Courtney, what is your feeling about EMF meters? Mm-hmm. Do they work?
Yes. EMF meter was one of the very first tools besides dowsing rods that I used when I started doing paranormal investigations. Yes, there is some credibility behind it, because when you take an EMF meter, you can go around the room and find out where these electrical spikes are. If I put it close to my phone's going to make it spike because it's an electrical device. So you can be in the middle of a room sitting on the floor. There's nothing that's spiking the meter. And then so you know that there must be something nearby spiking it up. Otherwise, what's the reasoning for it?
Yeah.
So I do think it is a nice, more scientific device to be able to use.
I also notice that sometimes when the EMF meter is spiking, the temperature changes around us too.
Yes, which then tells you too, if the temperature changes and there's no reasoning for that change, no wind, no air conditioning, no heat turning on, then you're noticing that it's something that is more scientific and more evident.
And how much does an EMF meter cost if someone wants to get an EMF meter? Because I know they come in kind of different shapes, sizes, and cost and price points.
They do. My first EMF device was one that lights up. So it starts with red, then goes all the way up, I think, to greenish yellow. And that one I think is under $70, which is really reasonable. So if you're starting out in the paranormal field, it's a great one to start with. I like the colors, because then you can also use the colors as a way of saying like, hey, if you're still here, light it up to green. and you can see if they can light it up to these specific
Mm-hmm.
colors. If you have one that has numbers, you could do the same though. Light it up to the specific number and see if they can do that.
So we have a more entry level one with the colors, but we also have a tri-field, a very fancy EMF. And those are much more expensive, right? I think I remember when we got ours, they're close to $200. And they're used for other things, not just paranormal investigations.
Correct. They can be used to finding electrical in the walls. It is definitely a construction.
Yeah, like
type tool
for engineering. Great. So that probably is one that if you're just getting into it would be a good one to get because it can kind of tell you if there's something around you.
Yes, it's a great starter entry one, especially the one with the colors.
Okay, so let's talk about laser grids. Now, I don't have experience with laser grids, but I know you do. And I know that, what I know is that laser grids are used in investigations. They weren't specifically designed for paranormal investigations. They adapted with a fairly simple theory in mind, creating kind of a spray of lasers in an area where shadow figures or apparitions have been, makes the shadow figures more apparent if they do manifest. So it basically eliminates, cases of your eyes playing tricks on you. They break the grid so there's something there. Now, tell me if I explain that right and how you define kind of what laser grids are, and have you used those before?
Yeah, you explained it very well. There are pieces to look out for. For instance, if someone on your investigation team walks through it, you have to look for those different patterns. But I do like it. I have one. I don't use it very often because you have to hold it in order to make the grid stay up, and that just gets
annoying.
So that is my experience with one, is just this one. But I do think there's some validity to it because, again, especially if you have a camera pointed at that and no one is moving around in the area and a shadow walks through it, it is evidence that something is going on. So I really love the idea of laser grids, and I think they can be very useful.
A beginner, though, wouldn't probably get a laser grid, right?
Probably not. They do tend to be on the more expensive side, except the one that you hold your finger on and the grid happens. But you have to hold your finger there for a really long time. And that, it's like, no, I have too many other things that I want to do and engage with and hold this on button down.
Okay, well, what about infrared cameras? Now, for those of you that are listening, they're pretty common today, but they were originally produced as an anti-aircraft defense system in 1929. Yeah. However, it wasn't until 1956 when this technology was declassified and released to the public. It's very interesting because it basically, it's like heat sensing, right, Courtney? It's through the camera. It senses intensity of heat.
Yes, it does sense the intensity of the heat, but it's not like one of those thermal cameras.
Okay.
So I haven't done a lot of work with infrared cameras. The most that I've done is I've purchased 2 separate times, 2 different brands of an infrared flash to put on my camera. And honestly, I've never gotten them to work. So I've given up on infrared cameras for the moment, but my goal is to be looking more into them so we can get some of those.
And some of these,
I think they have a good possibility.
Some of these, tools that you see, these tools of the trade, you'll see on these shows, but they have a whole team of people going in, and they have boxes and boxes of technology they set up, and they set everything up throughout wherever it is they're investigating in hopes that something will trigger one of these gadgets. And I think that true infrared cameras are not inexpensive. They can get pretty expensive, can't they?
Correct. Yeah. Yes, they can get pretty expensive. And you also have to be able to have the time to, when you're all done with the investigation, but you're still looking at the evidence, you have to have all that time to look through the video evidence or the videos to see if there's evidence. And so that's a piece of it too. is you have to make that time
And
for
you
it.
know what? I didn't really think about including this in here. We didn't talk about it, but infrared cameras, which are a little more costly versus video cameras. So a lot of investigators set up cameras throughout a house or a building and they just let them run and leave. And then they do have to go back through that footage. I did not include that in this, but video cameras in general are also an effective tool where you can leave them and go through footage and capture things that happened during some period of time.
Yes. Well, like for instance, any of those cameras that you have either in your house or on the
Right.
outside of your house, that can easily show paranormal
Absolutely.
things. I mean, that was one of the things you and I started getting together and talking about this, is because you were having those orbs and the paranormal things happen at your place
Yep.
out in Michigan.
Yep. And so both cameras, infrared and video cameras are also low cost. So if you can,
Hmm.
especially if you want to track and do some investigating in your own house, you just get those cameras off of Amazon or Ring cameras and set them up in the rooms, and you can run and set up the settings to trigger when there's a motion alert. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes I go back through my cameras at my house in Michigan just to see what's going on. And from time to time, they get set off by something, an orb. Sometimes it might be something driving by, but a lot of times it's things moving in the room. So it's kind of interesting. And sometimes they move because the air conditioning or the heating kicks on and something might blow and move. But in other cases, it's orbs. And I don't get as many as I
Yeah.
used to, but I still get some from time to time.
And orbs can be controversial because it could be a speck of dust, it could be a bug, it could be these different things. So orbs can be pretty controversial, and
Right.
that's something just for everyone just to be aware of. And people definitely have their views on what orbs are and aren't. When I do work with orbs, I always ask, like my camera work, I always say, all right, my intention is to capture things that are not physically present in a form of an actual thing like a spider. I want to capture the things that are not on
Yeah,
this
makes
worldly
sense.
dimension.
Temperature gauges. You don't necessarily always see a lot of that in investigations, but temperature gauges can definitely capture if you feel, say, an EMF meter, triggers that there's something trying to communicate or something in the room with you. Sometimes a temperature gauge, you can just aim and shoot the temperature gauge in front of you, and you can use that as a way to kind of scope the room out to see if there's any drastic drops in temperature, which can indicate that there could be something there, a spirit, energy, whatever. We don't talk about it very often, but temperature gauges are pretty legit. If you're in a room and you can feel something around you, or you want to verify when you feel that coldness that sometimes will hit you during an investigation. Yes. Any comments about temperature gauges are pretty straightforward. You can purchase them on Amazon. They're the same ones. Honestly, you could use the same ones. They wouldn't be quite as professional, but you can use the same ones you use on your head for a fever. You can shoot at things and it'll tell you the temperature. Or you can get real fancy and use the ones that are used for industrial use or cooking that go up to 900 degrees or whatever. What are your feelings about temperature gauges, and is that something that you think is common for people to have in their bag?
I think people used to have temperature gauges more frequently. I think it's less frequently now. And the reason is yes, it can actually record the temperature that's happening around you. And that is really great evidence to have. But what I'm also noticing is it does that one single thing. And that's where it's nice where tools have multi-purposes. So I've considered getting a temperature gauge in the past and I haven't. And my reasoning for that is I'd actually rather have one of those thermal cameras,
right,
than I would a temperature gauge.
Makes sense.
Because a thermal camera I find gives you more information or versus a temperature gauge. Yes, it's great, but at the same time, it tells you that there's a shift in temperature, but it doesn't give you much more information than that. So that's why I've chosen to not have one. Doesn't mean I won't at some point later on.
Makes sense. And I know that, again, there are so many different technologies and tools you can use. And, you don't necessarily have to have everything, but do you think it's good to have, at least two or three, because spirits and energy, don't always want to interact via one kind. They want some choices.
I agree. And like we talked about at the beginning, they may not always know how to use one of them. And so if we give them some options, then hopefully they can choose one of them that they feel comfortable using for communication.
So if I wasn't going old school and I was getting into paranormal investigating, are there like a couple, like two or three of all this technology that you think are just have to haves if you're going to start doing this as a hobby, or I guess even as a profession?
I would say getting an EMF meter, making sure you have some type of a video or device to video on, like your phone or an iPad. I don't think you need a fancy camera. What I use my iPad for is to take videos of me getting evidence.
Right.
And so I might take a video with the Roblox being on and see what comes up. And then I have that evidence in the video, which is nice to have. So I would say an EMF detector, something that can record. And also I really like the spirit box. Any of the spirit boxes. I really like the two that we have, and I think they're very, very helpful.
Great. This is part 1, and our next episode's going to have part 2, where we're going to go into, again, kind of the old school, but very effective tools that anyone can use and don't require batteries.
Yes. Hauling around batteries, making sure things are recharged.
Yeah. No, it's
definitely a different world we live in versus when I first started this 20-ish years ago.
And, as you pointed out to me, sometimes you get to where you're going, you go to put the batteries in, and because of the energy or spirits that are there, your batteries are dead.
Yep. That happens frequently because they can use that battery energy for their own energy and have some output.
So this is the end of part 1. We're going to cover old school in part 2. And remember, you can contact us on, and Courtney, tell them how they can get a hold of us.
Spirits and Cousins on Instagram, Spirits and Cousins on Facebook, and all of the different podcast apps. We have Apple, we have Spotify, we have iHeart, and Google.
Great. So, again, this is Tish. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.